首先介绍一些朋友，是印度驻上海的代表是戴瑞斯女士，非常谢谢她来。然后这个整个活动负责推动的动力，就是我们的好朋友张颂仁，那边Johnson坐在前面。其实这个活动很多上海的一些朋友帮了很多的忙，不一一介绍。那今天整个活动大概跟过去的几场进行的方式会是差不多的。假如您是第一次来的话，我大致说明一下，也就是今天早上的2个半小时的部分，我们请Nandi 先生讲。进行的翻译是用同步进行翻译的方式，然后他讲完了，假如时间太长，我们中间可能会休息一下。可是我们12点半必须结束。那么就是说早上第2个部分，开放给在场的听众们发问啊。然后下午是3点钟开始，我们请到了几位朋友来参与讨论。方式会是请他们3位先提问，先表达他们的意见。这次比较可惜的是，中国大陆著名的作家韩少功先生因为腰闪到了，所以临时没办法来。可是还是有其他几位朋友充分的做了准备，所以我相信今天整个活动会很精彩的。所以等到下面的。他们下午3位提了问以后，我们先请Nandi 先生回应，然后再开放做进一步的讨论。原则上大概到下午6点钟左右结束，大致上的程序会是这样。那在我介绍Nandi 先生以前，跟大家分享一下到组织工作吧，或者是策划到目前的一些基本的体会，或者说是一些观察。那么其实这个活动的组织不是那么容易，可是到目前为止好像进行的还蛮顺利的。其实也许不知道，从未来往回头来看的话，我们自己认为就是这个系列的活动有重要的一些历史意义。那么过去在我们中国人的意识里面，大概对印度的思想者的认识主要是泰戈尔，或者是甘地，或者是尼赫鲁。可是其实到了战后两边的知识界、思想界没有充分的对话，到了目前才慢慢的展开。所以我的理解是，这次主要的定位在社会思想的对话。企图是把这2个地方的思想者可以拉在一起，开始交换彼此的一些想法。也透过这样去认识彼此这些思想者后面深厚的社会吧，跟大家存在的这个历史。所以在这个意义底下，特别是放在世界的格局里面，印度和中国的思想界的对话其实是一个重要的里程碑，但是能够碰撞出来什么，我们不知道，要慢慢的观察。关键不在于这一次的对话而已，希望能够引起长期的一些互动关系。所以这一次我们主办花了很多的力气，包括做了很多翻译的工作，期待这些思想者的一些思想资源可以在中文世界里面广泛的流通。可是同时我大概也观察到其实上海地区有很多的朋友都参与到这个过程。我参加了第1场，发现其实更关切这个对话的应该是在上海地区的，我用这个字吧，外国朋友他们反而更关切2大国要对话了，会讲出来什么东西。其实在世界的变动的格局当中，印度和中国之间的关系是很重要的。我们知道期待最起码是在批判的思想界能够有充分的一些互动关系可以产生。我突然发现好像阿西斯没有耳机， 所以他完全弄不清楚状况，现在怎么办？没关系，这里有。那么，可是同时大概也观察到一些在组织工作上面其实有一定的困难，我必须很诚实的跟大家说，因为在中国的思想界或者学术思想界吧，有准备跟印度对话的，或者说有知识的诚意进行对话的人不好找，要不然就是完全的陌生，要不然就是没有准备。那么，所以到目前为止，可是我自己的理解是，到目前为止前面几场都还蛮热烈的。那我们知道这个只是一个起点，期待在未来有更长远的关系可以发展下去。那这个是上面跟大家简单的讲了一些到组织工作到目前的一些体会跟想法或感觉吧。那我接下来介绍一下南迪先生。那么我个人认识他是在1995年，他那个时候我们邀请他到台北来，有一个会议，所以是在那个脉络里面，所以到目前为止已经认识他15年了。然后对我个人而言，之后我们又发生了一些互动的一些关系，在不同的地方。我们其实上一次记得是是在他的办公室，在德里的办公室，他在他的这个叫做发展中社会研究中心Center for the Study of Developing Society。那么这些研究中心在印度的学术思想界扮演很重要的角色，是在大学的外部。不是大学的等同的学术体制，所以当初的成立都是一些特定的任务编组来进行的。那我这样介绍他吧，因为南迪先生著作非常多，那么我查了一下，到目前为止至少有20几本书。那我没有办法一一介绍，而且他的东西翻译成中文的也不多。那么非常非常的产量很大，那么可是在中国的朋友比较不太知道，我自己认为南迪先生是战后印度最重要的代表性的思想者他的东西是要理解印度思想界的话是跳不过去的那我自己认为是这样，可是他的影响力远远大出印度的范围。今天有一些朋友已经拿到他的讲稿，那么他用的一个关键字叫做南方也就是说整个南方世界。那么大概大家不容易理解的话，另外一个语汇也许比较亲切一点，会是第三世界。那么他的发言位置在这个整个第三世界或是南方是很重要的代表性人物。我只介绍他2本重要的著作，一个是1983年这本书叫做《亲密的敌人》那是在殖民主义体制下的自我的丧失跟重新的再发现这本书。那么这本书是1982年、83年出版的。那么其实在世界的范围内有很大很大的影响力，可是基本上被中文世界没有关注到。那么我们有一些朋友翻译了其中的一小部分，大概在将近5-6年以前出版过，在社会文化异丛，是不是就是宝强他们编的书系里面那篇对。那么那本书其实有人读过的话，从那个时候大概1980年代开始，我们就看到南迪先生其实对他有一个重要的一个参照点，就是中国大陆可是虽然他不是中国的研究者，所以他并没有办法很深入的进去，可是这个一直是他很重要的一个参照，从1980年代开始。所以这本书其实是在学界，就是说在英文的学界是被标记为一个里程碑的著作，大概会是在后来到了80年代中期或后期以后出现的后殖民研究，这个大概都是那一波的前身 那我自己认为它继承的一个知识上的一个谱系是在第三世界就是大家知道以法农为代表性的一个精神分析的一个传统，是在这里面它不继承了这一个脉络，可是放在南亚和印度的脉络里的。那么另外的一本重要的书是1994年，应该翻作《民族主义的不正当性》。那这本书主要的讨论是从泰戈尔来讨论的，也就是说，在印度的知识传统里面，不管从泰戈尔或者说甘地，那一路下来，包括到了南地先生，对于民族主义这件事情一直有很强烈的质疑，或者说反省或者说对于特别是跟民族主义相关的我们熟悉的民族国家这一件事情有很大的质疑。那我的理解是从很早南地先生就一直在提醒大家，民族国家作为一个欧洲殖民主义的产物被输出到世界，这件事情不是可以没有条件去接受的，必须要被不断的质疑和反思。那所以他们对于民族主义有很强的批判性，那并不是说不承认民族主义存在的重要性，可是这一件事情必须要被放在整个世界史、放在殖民史里面来看待。那么所以这两本书在国际的学界，特别是在英文世界里面造成很大的影响。一直除此之外，从70年代开始，在印度的内部，南地先生是很重要的。现在流行这个字叫做公共知识分子，可是当然这个语汇也有问题，就知识分子可以是不公共的嘛，就是可以有就私人的知识分子。所以这些语汇大概都是在西方学院里面有问题化的，被移植到我们自己的环境里面来。可是南迪先生一直在公共空间里面发言，所以几乎对于所有的重要的历史事件，大家都要等说，大家在等他怎么看待。所以在过去的从1970年代到现在，至少是40年以上的时间，那么他留下了很大量的对于历史现实的回应。所以要了解战后的这个印度的思想史，那么我一直认为南地先生是最重要的思想资源。所以我们非常非常难得，也高兴他今天昨天来到上海。那么他大概今年年初的时候也来过一次。那么昨天晚上吃饭，他说他感受到，他也讲不清楚，他觉得中国有一些学术界也好，有一些新的事情、新的动向在发生。那么我们也讲不清楚到底是什么，可是他有很强的这种感觉能力。所以我介绍他暂时到这个地方，所以请我们大家热烈的鼓掌，欢迎南地先生。
Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I have a Bengali accent and I shall try to speak slowly, so the translator as well as you do not have much of a problem. You will have some problem nonetheless. Thank you also for that very gracious introduction by Kwan Singh. I wish my wife was here. She is never convinced about my credentials. It is always an intellectual challenge to come to China and exchange ideas with two civilizations which have been in touch for at least 2000 years. This direct access to each other was disrupted in the 18th and 19th centuries, so that even though we are technically neighbors, we have to talk through intermediaries. And these intermediaries nowadays are the Western universities and Western auspices. I am speaking in a Western language, which during the last 2000 years, the India-China exchanges did not depend so much upon. I have no problem with the language, but I want to make this clear that there has been major disruptions. We have to talk to all our neighbors indirectly now. Go to the West and then come back to the neighbors. We also see it through the eyes of specialists on China, not through Chinese eyes often. That also is a pity, and I'm sure this is the case also with Chinese scholars studying India. In some sense, this is perhaps appropriate. Both of us have faced much dominance, seen much violence, and perhaps we have tried to compensate for it by trying to be equal to those who have dominated us, which also is an admission of defeat in some sense, because that identification with people who have dominated need not be have been or might not have been the last word on our self-definition. But we do feel insecure. We feel that if we are not careful, we shall again decline into what we were 100 years ago, and we have probably overcompensated. These are the two largest countries in the world today whose hidden ambition is to be proper 19th century European powers. Europe has moved, but we are stuck. We might have information technology and other postmodern apparatus, but basically, psychologically speaking, in our mind, we are trying to compensate for our past. And it has been always my effort to open up the past. And by opening up the past, open up the future too. Our future need not be what the present of Europe is. We are not today living out the past of Europe. Our present is studied as if it is the past of Europe, and our future is studied as if it is the present of Europe, or North America for that matter. This is a trap which does not allow us anymore to participate in opening up, pluralizing the global futures. We cannot even define our futures. If we try to do so, it looks like a romantic return to the past, or a acute case of nostalgia. Let us now get back to what I am supposed to talk today. That was by way of a preface. I will start with a quote from an Italian writer's book, Invisible Cities. The writer is Italo Calvino. It goes like this. In the lives of emperors, there is a moment which follows pride in the boundless extension of territories we have conquered, and the melancholy and relief of knowing we shall soon give up any thought or knowing and understanding them. There is a sense of emptiness that comes over us in the evening. It is the desperate moment when we discover that this empire, which had seemed to us the sum of all wonders, is an endless, formless ruin. That corruption's gangrene has spread too far to be healed by our scepter. That the triumph over enemy sovereigns has made us the heirs of their long undoing. In battling the enemy, perhaps we are becoming more like our enemies. That's by way, again, of a second preface. In the political cultures of Asia and Africa, colonialism has set up binary oppositions between tradition and modernity. They are supposed to be each other's opposite. And there are two ways of handling it. And people have handled in two ways, broadly speaking. The first way of handling it is to see each of them as a negation of the other. Tradition was what modernity is not. And modernity too is therefore what tradition is not. Each one negates the other fully. Now, this is not, I would like to point out, a flawed way of looking at it. Because everything said that allows some degree of mutual criticisms. It is like saying that the city is what the village is not, and the village is what the city is not. So it has the scope that it gives both sides to supply a critique of the culture of the other. But it also has the problem that if one of them becomes too dominant, then very little scope is left for the other. And I think modernity has won the day in our societies. We are fearful of traditions. We feel that somehow it contaminates our modernity. Our people are not what they should be. And we need an enlightened vanguard which will guide us towards a better future, better modern future, by liberating us from our traditions. The second way of looking at it is, which also you will find in our societies, that some part of our traditions are compatible with modernity, some parts are not. Those parts which are compatible are good, those parts which are incompatible are bad. And modernity can be defined in many ways. I take a very standard view of it, but you don't have to do it. For example, you can include it in development, so you can say those parts of Chinese culture are good, which are compatible with development. Those parts of Chinese culture are bad, which are not compatible with development. And try to redesign your culture and civilization. The only part, I am a little uncomfortable about these two, because I notice that in human affairs, no idea remains permanently fashionable or dominant. So by the time you have worked very hard to re-engineer Chinese or Indian civilization to become developed or modern, by that time fashions change, people begin to talk of postmodernism, and people begin to provide critiques of development from the point of view of ecology or sustainability or inequity or whatever. So, but in the meanwhile, you have built a culture which is supposed to facilitate development. So you have to run and try to re-engineer the culture in another way. Cultures are very difficult to re-engineer, and I am never very sure whether even the great engineers of culture ultimately engineer the culture or the culture engineers them. One of my most rewarding moments in China was when I discovered that Comrade Mao Zedong has become a kind of minor god, and you can buy charms of him which the truck drivers buy to protect them against accidents. So I am not sure whether Chinese civilization has engineered Comrade Mao or Comrade Mao engineered Chinese culture, and this happens in every culture. Civilizations have a way of handling things, which we underestimate its capacities. I in fact purchased a large number of these charms to give to my Maoist friends in India. India has a lot of admirers of Mao, and they thought it was in very bad taste. They didn't appreciate the gift at all. Anyway, the second way of handling tradition and modernity is to say that those parts of tradition which are compatible with modernity are the only true parts of tradition. Authentic traditions, authentic cultures, whether again it is China or India, is compatible with modernity, as if the Chinese have been all their lives reading the Enlightenment texts of 17th century Europe, and the authentic, the core culture, the classical culture of this civilization or the Indic civilization is compatible with the best of modernity. It is rational, progressive, philosophically sophisticated, and so on and so forth. The distinguished Indian economist Amartya Sen is a major votary of this point of view. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to fit in a civilization or culture A civilization and a culture, I will distinguish. In civilization is actually a confederation of cultures. It has a very broad framework. Just when you have decided that something is central to the culture, others say no, that is not central, that is peripheral, or that is a minor comment from which you have teased out something which you like. And if you look at the culture as a whole, it has other kind of priorities. After all, a civilization is not a grocery store. You cannot go and pick up from there things which you like and not pick up things which you do not like. Civilization is a configuration. It is a configuration of cultures and subcultures, and it has enormous pluralities, so that the checks and counter checks within the civilization allows the civilization to correct itself. It is not waiting for you to correct it, it corrects itself. But I wouldn't push it very much. I would leave it at this stage. These two ways of distinguishing tradition and modernity are the predominant modes of conceptualizing it in the popular intellectual culture globally. I don't confine this to China or India. This is probably in the whole of the globe, but perhaps it more pronounced in the southern hemisphere. I have seen similar development, similar writings in Africa, and even to some extent in Latin America, which is basically dominated by European culture in many sense, but you have seen that. But I want to mention this because this is the context in which I shall talk, but my concern is slightly different. I am suggesting to you that there is a clear distinction between two modes of seeing tradition. And by tradition, I want to specify, I do not mean our classical cultures. I do not mean the so-called high cultures. I do not mean Beijing opera or Bharatnatyam or Sanskritic studies. The modern states always like to concentrate on the classical traditions because that is often a unified whole. This gives you a false sense of access to the core of the culture. Civilizations always is a dynamic interaction between the classical and the non-classical, the popular and the elitist. And these two have in their dynamics this interaction between the classical and the folk, classical and the popular, the everyday and the formalized ones. They always have a tendency to use this dynamic as a way of renewing itself. And to that extent, a civilization or a culture stays with the people. It doesn't stay, it's only in the texts. That's a much less important part of it. It stays with the people, in the way people think, in the mythos of the society, in the structure of thought, and in the larger subjectivities which define it. And this popular is not something which a modern state is always uncomfortable with, because it is invariably plural, it is invariably autonomous of both state structures and also the large institutional interventions which we expect to change the society, and they are very persistent even when they seem to be dead. And this lies even within those who are ideologically committed to the abolition or destruction of all traditions. The way Confucius is coming back into Chinese political culture these days is a good example of that. I am old enough to remember the days when Confucius himself was seen as a demonic presence in the Chinese society, and I am seeing a different story unfolding in front of my eyes today. If you live long enough, you always see this happens in civilization. It always happens. This is the story. So I will not believe with Professor Amartya Sen also that Indian classics gave you all the values with enlightenment in Europe gave the world. And it would have been pointless in that sense. All if it had to do is to give us the enlightenment values that we already have been hearing about it for 200 years. As we know, very well know, that 17th century Europe gave the last answer to all the basic human questions once for all in 17th century, and all we are left to do today is to write footnotes to those answers in the rest of the world. But we all know that. I don't want to go into that. But I do believe that it is that chaotic, messy interaction between what we like to consider the 5,000 years of Chinese history or the 5,000 years of Indian history or Indian culture or civilization, that is basically and always an interaction between the way people have lived and thought in everyday life and what you have in text, what is immortalized by certain key figures in our history, past. Hence, my main proposition in this paper. My main proposition is this, that when it comes to intellectual creativity, we notice that modernity and responses to it have gone in two ways. In the humanities, plastic arts, and arts in general, modernity has triggered enormous creativities. It has opened up new possibilities. It has challenged tradition, and tradition has met it, in the sense that people have confidently responded to that challenge. But when it comes to social knowledge or political knowledge, when it comes to social sciences, if you want to be specific, then it has not happened that way. We have not produced great social and political thinkers. And our social and political thought is organized around essentially great 19th century social and political thinkers of Europe. Why this difference? We have produced great artists, great writers, great musicians. Great poetry. Why have not we produced great political and social thinkers? Can you, for example, take the name of half a dozen persons who you think has produced great social and political thought and discuss them independently of what has been done in 18th and 19th century Europe, or 17th, 18th, 19th century Europe? I doubt if you can. I doubt if you can. If you look back at China, you will find the same story. There are exceptions who have tried to back out of the mold. There are. If I have time, I might mention one or two of them later on, or both countries. But on the whole, our knowledge industry, our educational system, the people who influence us, who challenge us in our thought, are invariably people who have operated within a framework which has very little to do with the overall frameworks, the range of frameworks that our civilizations offer. This is not only true of Asia, but also Africa and Latin America. Entire southern hemisphere. You can safely say this without facing much protest. In fact, those who will protest will again have to quote some Western authorities to make the protest. That's our tragedy. That's our tragedy. And I have a feeling that basically this is because in the humanities and arts, there is a sense of loss even when you jettison tradition on rational or ideological grounds. When you say we must jettison tradition, that sense of loss slips in because humanities and arts are not fully are areas of human endeavor which are not fully under the control of those who are producing great art, great music, great poetry. You might be a committed ideologue, but when you write or when you paint, you are not fully control of your media. Somewhere that sense of loss comes in. And that gives, even when you give up traditions, that gives a different kind of depth to your entry into modernity too. Even in European experience, if you look at it, somebody like Nietzsche, when he talks of death of God, in fact, he talks of theocide, you can call it. We have killed God. That sense of loss, when he talks that we are of killing God, but he himself shares that position, but nonetheless there is this sense that we have killed God. And like patricide, that loss of belief and faith also arouses guilt and some compensatory or reparative gestures that suffuses your work, even when you are a full-fledged ideologue of modernity, when you are claimed to be a hardcore Marxist, that influences your work. That sense of loss is not possible in social and political knowledge, because that is a much more of a cognitive process. You are much more control of your media, so to speak. The way you think, you are controlling it. You are in full control of yourself, much fuller control of yourself. Nobody is entirely in control of oneself. And hence, you make sure that there is this sense of loss, the loss of older ways of looking at things, loss of entire ways of entire systems of knowledge, loss of access simultaneously of the way ordinary people think, because ordinary people continue with that. They continue. You cannot have a thought police monitoring and supervising to make sure that everybody thinks in the right way. You can only ensure that they use the right slogans in public. So you sing paeans to rationality, secularism, progress, development, and so on and so forth, and you force the people to learn that as slogans, but their frame of reference remains different. They continue to think in their own way about these experiences. So you lose the touch also with them, and this shows in your work. It becomes disjuncted from the reality around you. It even disjuncts you from your ancestors, because modernity also has ancestors. Europe and North America always talks of the Greek civilization, Athenian democracy, from which European ideas of modernity has come. Now, if you talk of your ancestors, that of course is retrogression, going back into the past, nostalgia and romantic invocation of the past. But they can talk about their past because of the Hellenic civilization. So the rest of the world is supposed to suffer from an acute case of ancestor envy. Because Greek was their ancestor, even though Greek at the time of Athenian democracy, Greece was closer to Egypt and India and Persia than to West Europe. It had little to do with West Europe. It had much more to do with the Mediterranean world, much more to do with Persia, Egypt and India than with West Europe itself. But nobody remembers that. Nobody wants to talk about that. And we are supposed to be perpetually suffer from this ancestor envy, because we cannot go back to our ancestors, others can. So, this is the basic problem with the kind of knowledge systems with which we are working. This is not a plea to reject the whole of the social sciences or political analysis, traditions of political analysis and so on and so forth. I am not saying that all our education is false. I am merely saying that at least have the awareness that we are losing out something. At least grant our people the right to think for themselves and try to find out how they do so. At least build into your theoretical frame something of the categories they use. Because that would give your favorite theories, your vision, greater sustainability. This is another kind of ecological sustainability, you can say, where I am suggesting that your ideas and their relevance will acquire a different kind of depth and probably a slightly greater touch of permanence if you have at least that sense of loss. The loss of the kind Nietzsche recognized, and which you see in Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, the great Russian writers, you say in the West also. But West can afford, as I was telling you, West allows you to lament the loss of their traditions. It doesn't allow you to lament the loss of your traditions and our traditions. That is the tragic part of the story. I would like to end this presentation because I made my main point and I would have gone on. I don't want to go on a theme, but I want to make 2 or 3 other points. I had given some examples, but on second thoughts, I will not use the examples so much. But I want to concentrate on 3 or 4 issues, time permitting. First, what I am suggesting gives you a possible new ways of open. I am not suggesting you a perfect cure of the colonial hangover. I am only suggesting, just because I am raising some questions doesn't mean I have all the answers. I am merely saying that I am suggesting to you that this will possible, that will open up some of the possibilities that are inherent in this process. And I will start by giving you, I work on genocide these days, and I will give an example from it to start with. I found out, looking at the data of the last 100 years on genocide, which I didn't collect, a distinguished scholar, R.J. Ramel, collected it of University of Hawaii. It's very old now, in the 80s. 20th century genocide. In 20th century, roughly, because his data also slightly incomplete, some more data has come in, roughly 220 million people were killed in genocide. Out of them, I could discover only something like between 8 to 10 million who died in religious violence. Actually even less, but on the outside 8 to 10 million on religious violence out of 220 million. Out of 220 million, about between 160 and 170 million have died or been killed in the name of ideologies. Ideologies, including nationalism and communism. You can look at the data another way. That 2/3 of these 220 million have been killed, little less than 2/3 have been killed by their own states. The worst case is that of Kampuchea, where 1/3 of the country was killed by the Kampuchean state itself. So in some ways, your own state may be worse for your health than any foreign enemies. Also, looked at a third way, about of these 220 million killed, nearly 2/3 have died in the hands of secular states. If that is any consolation to you. So you can console yourself even while going to your death that I was killed by a secular, progressive, modern, nationalistic state. That's about the record. I would say, in some ways, more modest states, less ambitious states have done better. I'm an Indian and I hear enormous amount of noise in India today about why India should gradually become a superpower, join the Security Council and join the great powers. I am deadly afraid of that. I don't want a superpower in India. I think we can do much better being a most modest power. I'm afraid of states which are ambitious. It is for you to decide what you want to say to your rulers in China. This is an effort to replicate the success of your rulers in 19th century. These are the last two 19th century states, modern states, whose ambition is 19th century, in 21st century. In 21st century, China and India are the only two states which, despite whatever they might say in paper, their secret ambition is to equal their rulers in the 19th century. This is their unconscious. If I am a Freudian, so please allow me to talk of unconscious. This is the model. So this is by way of the first point. Built into the civilizational process itself, that gives the civilization its autonomy. That gives it its power, that it has built-in process of criticism so that it can self-correct itself. That's why that whenever something goes wrong, it doesn't have to automatically go outside to import them. So even if we want to become modern, we cannot afford to relax our guard and obviate or eliminate all possible criticisms of it. because then you are not modern. This is a paradox built into it. It is a paradox built into the process of modernity. And I think this is built also into civilizations. Has this moderation we have built, or have we overcorrected in attempt to become modern? Are we willing to confront the responsibility of developing criticisms of our modernity, identifying its limits? Have we used traditions as a source of criticism of modernity, while using modernity as a source of criticism of traditions? I think our scholars have shunned that responsibility to a great extent. Somewhere, this responsibility have not been shouldered by us. That was by way of my second comment. Third, we have gradually built an intellectual culture where the intellectuals look at themselves as a kind of vanguard of the proletariat, or something of akin to that. Marxism has this theory of vanguard theory, that an elite vanguard will provide the voice to the people. Michel Foucault has said that there is nothing more obscene than speaking on behalf of somebody else. But to say that also, you have to bring in Michel Foucault. That's a tragedy. I thought this would have been common sense. But the fact of the matter is this, that this is a dangerous development in the age of ideologies. I have come to see this in virtually every ideology. I have become gradually, it wasn't the case, I mean my earlier writings will not show you, recent writings began to reflect this. I have become a critic of ideologies themselves. Because ideologies are transient and do not have the sustainability of religions or faiths. They do not have people who are they don't produce people who will reinterpret the ideologies at right time for the sake of new situations, new realities. And their base is thinner and skin deep, much lesser depth. Religions at least has done this over the centuries. They have adapted to monarchies, nation states, new cultures all over the world, and in the process changed themselves. Christianity today is not it was 300 years ago it was. Nor is Buddhism what it was even 100 years earlier. And there are some changes which are good, some changes which are bad. I am not going into that. But this constant interpretation and reinterpretation allows you, because people have certain interest in it, even if they don't believe, even if you are not a thinker, in the way you adapt your religion to new situations. When you go and settle down in another country, when you move for your professional reasons, that itself changes, puts some pressure on the practitioners of the faith to change it, give it new content. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that Hinduism and Buddhism, people talk of them as 2,000-year-old religions, faiths. I will consider themselves very new religions. Hinduism, as we see it or meet it in the public life of India today, in the middle class, urban middle class India, was born only in the 19th century. It's a very young faith. And Buddhism, as you see it in Sri Lanka, or Islam as you see it in South Asia, or Southeast Asia for that matter, is a very young faith. I don't think it is more than, it's not even 100 years old. Hinduism probably is not more than 200 years old. Buddhism, and again another 100 years old. Hinduism is little older because British colonial regime was established in India 250 years earlier. So Hinduism, these new changes came. Somebody has said that all these faiths have incorporated parts of Christianity and so on and so forth. For instance, and I am pretty sure from what I have read, not what I am no expert on China, that perhaps to some extent this was what religion was like in China too. Namely, that in India, Hinduism is essentially a localized faith. Every village has its village gods and goddesses. His vernacular religious practices, language of religion was the local language. Every family has its family priests, family gods, family goddesses. The diversity was mind-boggling. There are supposed to be 330 million gods and goddesses in Hinduism. So no expert can also enumerate them for you. They are supposed to be innumerable and basically infinite. The closest second I think is Shintoism, which is supposed to have 8 million gods and goddesses. That's what I'm told. This diversity is gradually yielding way to a more monolithic form of Hinduism with centralized texts since early 19th century. In fact, one can date when certain texts were considered almost corresponding to the Bible, for instance. So, Hinduism is now a religion in the sense in which Christianity is a religion. At least Protestant and Catholic Christianity is religion. It is not like the way Christianity in India was practiced for 2000 years. St. Thomas came to India 68 AD. That also had the same characteristics. And the Islam being practiced now is also a textual form of Islam, which has emerged as the authoritative voice of Islam. It was never this way, even 50 years ago. Now, but nonetheless, because it is this new Hinduism, new Islam, new Buddhism, because it's a joint product of millions of people, has a different kind of life than ideologies, which is what I was trying to make in a very roundabout way. Ideologies do not have that kind of inputs, and therefore they're exceedingly self-confident. This built-in element of certitude. Somewhere I have tried to enumerate the distinction between ideologies and faiths. And in many countries now, ideologies now have become a substitute for religions. So therefore ideologies acquire the certitude and require the certitude even more. And it's sometimes even religion is being used as an ideology. This is a new development. The Hindu extremists in India owe their allegiance to Mr. Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar, who wrote authoritative Bible for the Hindu nationalists, Hindu extremists, called Hindutva. I was very surprised when I read that he himself was an atheist. Didn't believe in Hinduism, but he used it like an ideology, because what he wanted was a proper nationality in India, because he wanted to build a nation state. He was a freedom fighter. He wanted to have India a proper nationality so that it could wage the freedom struggle better. And to wage the freedom struggle, you need to have a nationality. In India, there was nothing called a nationality. There was no nation. So he thought, after much deliberation, he was himself a secular person, but he thought that the only community which can provide a nationality, which can be beaten into a nationality, they didn't provide, is a very difficult community to handle, because the Hindus didn't even call themselves Hindus, outsiders called them Hindus. So he wanted to beat the Hindus into a nationality so that it could sustain a future nation state of India. And that's why he became a Hindu extremist. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was responsible for creating Pakistan on religious grounds, was a non-believer. He was not a practicing Muslim. He cared two hoots for Islam. So this is something which is new. But there is one final identifier. There are many others, but I don't want to go into it. One final identifier which I must list for your sake. Ideologues always hate. I have found no exception up till now. I'm waiting. Maybe I will find. Next time if we meet, I will say no, there is exception. But ideologues, I have not always. If you look deep into them, hate the targeted beneficiaries of their ideology. I want to repeat this because this is very important. Ideologues always dislike and hate the targeted beneficiaries of the ideology. And this is for all ideologues. So nationalists always hate the fellow citizens for not being nationalist enough. The Marxists always hate the proletariat for not being revolutionary enough. The feminists always hate women for not being feminist enough. I have not found till now any exception to the rule. And I mention this in the context of this paper because I think the modernizers of our society have assumed the role of a vanguard where they are herding or pushing a recalcitrant, imperfect citizenry towards a better future because the citizens don't know better. The people do not know. They do not know how much they should know. They are not fit for a great nation. So we have to push them like unwilling cattle towards a better future. That is the source of what I was trying. That is the consequence of there being no sense of loss, no sense of loss. That we know what is best for them. We, the modern, educated, well-qualified intellectuals, know what the people should want, and we must push them towards them. They are unwilling, do not know what they should know. This is, I think, the ultimate. One final comment, and I would like to say there are always limits to social engineering, political engineering, national engineering, and civilization engineering. Of course, there is always limits. Scientific engineering, re-engineering, re-engineering, there are always limits, because the kind of certitude we want to have, you can never have in social affairs and political affairs. This is not mathematical calculation that 2 plus 2 will always make 4. In social and political knowledge, it can be 22, not 4. And my favorite story is the one I accidentally find out. I do not know how true it is. It may be apocryphal. But the father of modern science, Sir Francis Bacon, the one who said, knowledge is power, science is power. He, when he was old, once thought he will find out what will happen if you force feed a chicken with snow. Snow. I don't think it was a very intelligent question, because I could have told him what would happen. And that's what happened. On a winter day, when it was snowing at London, Sir Francis took a live chicken and went out to his own house, the garden in front of his house, and began feeding the chicken with snow. And the chicken died. Not very surprisingly to us. He died. But in the process, Sir Francis caught pneumonia and died himself. So, whether it is in nature or in politics, there are built-in limits. There are built-in limits. I can give you other examples if you like, this kind, but let me stop there. Thank you very much. You have been very kind and very patient.